Everything in his apartment was in place. His wallet, phone, even a cup of unfinished coffee. Only he was gone. Disappeared without locking the door, without taking his belongings, leaving behind a single clue, a word written with a trembling hand on the mirror: "He is here." I'm Detective Evan Murray. I work in the 15th Precinct in Manhattan, specializing in missing persons cases. 15 years on the job has taught me that most disappearances aren't mysteries at all. People vanish because they want to, escaping debts, troubled relationships, or lives that have become unbearable. I've developed a knack for reading between the lines, seeing the hidden motivations that drive someone to simply walk away. But as I stood in Jason Wheeler's apartment on that crisp October morning, something felt fundamentally wrong. The air was dense with an unsettling stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Jason Wheeler, 32, a journalist for the New York Metropolitan Daily, had disappeared 3 days ago. His editor, Marion Slater, called it in after he missed an important deadline and 2 days of work. Wheeler had never missed a deadline in his 4 years at the paper, she'd emphasized. His cell phone was going straight to voicemail, and his usually active social media accounts had gone silent. He was working on something big, Slater had told me, worry creasing her brow. He wouldn't just disappear unless something happened. I'd nodded, making a note, but not entirely convinced. Journalists were dramatic by nature. But now, standing in his East Village apartment, I was beginning to share her concern. The door had been unlocked when I arrived. No signs of forced entry. The superintendent let me in after I showed my badge, his face pinched with worry. "Nice guy, that Wheeler," he'd said. "Always paid rent on time." Inside, the apartment was immaculate, eerily so. Everything looked as if Wheeler had just stepped out for a coffee and would return any minute. His laptop sat open on the kitchen table, the screensaver a slowly shifting kaleidoscope of colors. I moved the mouse, and the browser sprang to life, displaying an article titled "The Vanishing Point: Exploring America's Anomalous Zones." Multiple tabs were open: research sites, maps, missing persons databases. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat beside the computer, a thin film of mold beginning to form on its surface. 3 days old, consistent with his disappearance. His wallet lay next to it, containing $43 in cash, credit cards, ID, everything intact. A stack of notebooks was piled neatly beside the laptop. I began flipping through them, each page filled with Wheeler's cramped, meticulous handwriting. Most contained interview notes, article drafts, nothing unusual for a journalist. Until I reached the most recent one. The handwriting changed on the last few pages, becoming increasingly erratic. The neat lines gave way to scattered thoughts, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had torn through in places. "I know he's watching. I hear him at night. He was in the hallway. Now he's closer." I frowned, turning the page. More frantic writing. "I'm not crazy. I can prove it. The camera doesn't lie. I'll show them all." Damn journalist, I thought. Always loved to create suspense, even in his personal notes. But something about the desperation in those words made my stomach tighten. This didn't read like a man planning to disappear. It read like a man terrified. The apartment was a standard one-bedroom, sparsely decorated but clean. Nothing seemed out of place in the living room or kitchen. I moved to the bathroom, pushing open the half-closed door. The fluorescent light flickered as I switched it on, casting harsh shadows across the white tiles. And there, on the mirror above the sink, smeared letters in what looked like steam or condensation: "He is here." I stepped closer, examining the writing. It wasn't carved or written in anything visible. Just the residue of a finger dragged through moisture on glass. Recent enough that it hadn't fully evaporated. My reflection stared back at me from around the words, my face grim. 15 years of detective work teaches you to look for the rational explanation first. A prank. A publicity stunt. A mental break. But the coldness creeping up my spine suggested something else. I continued my search through the apartment, methodically checking each room. The bedroom was last, and that's where I found the anomaly. A digital camera mounted on a tripod stood at the foot of the bed, its lens pointed directly at the rumpled sheets. The red light indicated it was still recording. I approached it carefully, noting the expensive model, not something a journalist would typically splurge on unless it was for a specific purpose. I pressed the stop button, then navigated to the playback function. The screen flickered to life, showing a timestamp from 3 nights ago, 2:14 a.m. Jason was asleep in his bed, the sheets rising and falling with his steady breathing. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of a digital alarm clock on the nightstand. Everything appeared normal. I fast-forwarded slightly, watching the minutes tick by. 2:20, 2:30. At 2:37, something caught my eye. A slight movement in the far corner of the room, just a flicker at the edge of the frame. I rewound, played it again at normal speed. There, a subtle shift in the shadows by the window. The curtains moved, swaying gently as if disturbed by a breeze. But the windows were closed, I'd checked them myself. I leaned closer to the small screen, scrutinizing every pixel. At 2:42, Jason suddenly sat bolt upright in bed, his body tense. He stared fixedly into the darkened corner of the room, his expression changing from confusion to unmistakable terror. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. The camera recorded video only, no audio. "What did you see?" I whispered to the screen. The timestamp hit 2:45, and the video began to distort. Static lines crossed the screen, the image breaking apart. And in that moment of digital disruption, I saw it. In the corner by the wardrobe, a shadow took form, darker than the surrounding darkness, tall, with indistinct edges but unmistakably humanoid. It wasn't a trick of the light or camera malfunction, there was intention in its stillness, a presence that seemed to be observing. Jason's reaction was immediate. He lunged from the bed, scrambling toward the door, his face a mask of absolute horror. The video cut to black abruptly at 2:46. I stood there, the camera in my hands, a chill crawling up my spine that had nothing to do with the apartment's temperature. Rational explanations began forming in my mind: an intruder, a practical joke gone wrong, a hallucination on Wheeler's part. But none of them sat right with me. I checked the phone on the nightstand. A standard iPhone, password protected. I bagged it as evidence, planning to get a warrant to access its contents. But curiosity got the better of me. I pressed the home button, and to my surprise, it opened without requiring a password. Either Wheeler had disabled that function, or someone had done it after his disappearance. I navigated to the call log. Several work-related calls, a few to a mom, some to take-out restaurants. And then, the final outgoing call at 2:46 a.m., 3 nights ago. To my cell phone number. My blood ran cold. I'd never given Wheeler my personal number. We'd never met before today. How did he have my contact information? And more importantly, why would he call me, a detective he didn't know, in what appeared to be a moment of extreme distress? I pulled out my own phone, checking my call history. Nothing at 2:46 a.m. 3 days ago. No missed calls, no unknown numbers. It was as if the call had been erased, or had never connected in the first place. The implications made me uneasy. I took a step back, surveying the room again with fresh eyes. Nothing seemed disturbed. No signs of struggle. Just a man who apparently got out of bed in terror and vanished into the night, leaving everything behind. I spent another hour in the apartment, gathering evidence, taking photographs, bagging the notebooks and the camera. Standard procedure. But my mind kept returning to that shadow in the video, to the call that never arrived, to the words on the mirror, "He is here." Back at the precinct, I logged the evidence and began writing my preliminary report. Wheeler's editor, Slater, was waiting for me, her face lined with worry. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. I hesitated, deciding how much to share. "Nothing conclusive," I said finally. "No signs of forced entry or struggle. His personal belongings are still there. It looks like he left voluntarily, but..." "But what?" she pressed. "Something doesn't add up," I admitted. "I'm going to check into his recent work. Was he investigating anything sensitive? Something that might have put him at risk?" Slater's expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing her features. "He was working on a series about disappearances," she said. "People who vanished under unusual circumstances. He was obsessed with it, to be honest. I was about to pull him off it. He was getting strange about the whole thing." "Strange how?" She hesitated, tucking a strand of graying hair behind her ear. "Paranoid. Started talking about patterns, connections. Said he was being watched." She looked up at me, her eyes troubled. "I thought it was just journalist intensity, you know. They can get so wrapped up in their stories sometimes. But now..." I nodded, understanding all too well. "I'll need access to his files at the paper, his research." "Of course," she said quickly. "Anything you need." An hour later, I was seated at Wheeler's desk in the Metropolitan Daily's open-plan office. The newsroom hummed with activity around me, reporters and editors moving with the controlled chaos typical of an approaching deadline. Wheeler's workspace was meticulously organized, computer, notepads, and reference materials all arranged with precision. I logged into his computer using the credentials Slater had provided and began sifting through his files. Most were straightforward journalistic work, interviews, drafts, research for various stories. I focused on his most recent project, the Disappearance series. The article drafts were well written but fairly standard true crime fare, detailing cases of people who had vanished under mysterious circumstances across the country. Wheeler had a talent for humanizing the missing, painting vivid portraits of lives interrupted. But as I delved deeper into his research files, I noticed a shift in tone and focus. His notes became increasingly fixated on certain patterns, disappearances where the missing person had left behind all personal belongings, cases where witnesses reported strange phenomena beforehand, instances where electronic equipment malfunctioned around the time of disappearance. Wheeler had begun connecting dots that, to my detective's eye, seemed tenuous at best. And then I found it, buried in a subfolder labeled simply Mirror Man. A case from 4 years ago involving a Manhattan banker named Richard Corliss. According to Wheeler's notes, Corliss had disappeared from his locked apartment, leaving behind wallet, keys, phone, all the essentials. The only clue, the words, "He is here," written on his bathroom mirror. My pulse quickened. This couldn't be coincidence. Wheeler had extensively researched Corliss's case, compiling police reports, witness statements, and background information. The investigating detective had been Marcus Donovan, now retired. I made a note to track him down. As I dug deeper, I discovered something unexpected. Wheeler had been in contact with Corliss's sister, Andrea. There were email exchanges, interview notes. According to Andrea, her brother had been acting strangely in the weeks before his disappearance, claiming he was being watched, hearing noises in his apartment at night, seeing shadows where there shouldn't be any. The parallels to Wheeler's own behavior were unmistakable. More disturbing was an audio recording dated just 1 week before Wheeler's disappearance. I plugged in headphones and pressed play. "I'm continuing my investigation into the Mirror Man phenomenon," Wheeler's voice came through, professional but with an undercurrent of tension. "The pattern is becoming clearer. All victims report the same progression, first the feeling of being watched, then auditory disturbances, followed by visual manifestations. The entity, if that's what it is, seems to observe before it acts. And always, the same message is left behind. He is here." There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. I've identified 12 cases over the past decade that fit the pattern. The authorities have classified them as missing persons, presumed dead, or in some cases, voluntary disappearances. But I believe they're connected. I believe something is taking these people. And I think. His voice faltered. I think it's found me too. The recording ended with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet office space. I sat back, an uncomfortable weight settling in my chest. Wheeler hadn't just been researching these disappearances, he'd become convinced he was the next target. A shadow fell across the desk, and I looked up to find a young woman standing there, eyeing me suspiciously. "You the detective looking into Jason's case?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight Boston accent. I nodded. "Detective Murray. And you are?" "Eliza Chen. I sit across from Jason." She gestured to the desk opposite Wheeler's. "We were working together on some stories. Including the disappearance series?" I asked. She frowned, shaking her head. "No, that was his pet project. He was weirdly protective of it. Wouldn't let anyone else touch it." "Did you notice anything unusual about his behavior recently?" Eliza hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure no one was listening. "He was different the last couple weeks. Jumpy. Kept thinking someone was watching him." She leaned in closer. "The day before he disappeared, he gave me this." She held out a USB drive, small and black. "Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to the police." I thought he was being dramatic. Jason always had a flair for that, but now. She shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. I took the drive, turning it over in my hand. "Did you look at what's on it?" "Tried to. It's encrypted." She met my eyes steadily. Jason was scared of something, detective. Really scared. And Jason wasn't the type to spook easily. I thanked her, pocketing the drive, and continued gathering Wheeler's research materials. By the time I left the newsroom, dusk had fallen, casting long shadows across the city. I had a car full of evidence, a head full of questions, and a growing sense that this case was unlike any I'd handled before. My next stop was the home of retired Detective Marcus Donovan in Queens. He answered the door on the third knock, a grizzled man in his 60s with the perpetually alert eyes of someone who'd spent decades watching for danger. "Donovan. I'm Detective Evan Murray, 15th Precinct." I showed him my badge. "I'd like to talk to you about an old case of yours." "Richard Corliss." His expression changed instantly, wariness replacing the polite curiosity. "You better come in," he said, stepping aside. Donovan's living room was neat but Spartan, the furniture well-worn. Photographs of a police career lined the walls, commendations, group shots, retirement parties. He gestured for me to sit on the couch while he lowered himself carefully into a recliner. "Why are you digging up Corliss?" he asked without preamble. "That case has been cold for years." I explained about Wheeler's disappearance, the similarities between the cases, the message on the mirror. With each detail, Donovan's face grew more troubled. "Damn," he muttered when I finished. "It's happening again." "You believe there was something unusual about Corliss's disappearance?" I prompted. He laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Unusual doesn't begin to cover it." But nobody wanted to hear it. My lieutenant, the commissioner, they all wanted a nice, neat explanation. Mental breakdown. Suicide. Maybe he just walked away from his life. He shook his head. I knew better. "What did you find?" I leaned forward, sensing I was finally about to get some answers. Donovan's eyes met mine, searching. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he continued. "Corliss left behind some recordings, just like your journalist. He'd set up cameras in his apartment because he felt he was being watched. Most of the footage showed nothing, just an empty apartment. But on the night he disappeared, He paused, taking a sip from a glass of water on the side table. On the night he disappeared, the cameras caught something. Just for a frame or two. A figure, tall, indistinct. Standing in his bedroom while he slept. And then the footage distorted, like there was some kind of electrical interference. When it cleared, Corliss was gone. The description matched what I'd seen on Wheeler's camera almost exactly. Did you identify the intruder? That's just it, Donovan said, his voice dropping lower. There was no intruder. The building had security cameras in all the hallways, the lobby, the exits. No one entered or left Corliss's apartment that night except Corliss himself, earlier in the evening. And he never came out. That's impossible, I said automatically, even as cold unease settled in my stomach. That's what everyone said. Donovan's expression was grim. The case went nowhere. No body, no evidence of foul play except for a message on a mirror and some corrupted video footage. Eventually, it was filed away, another unsolved mystery in a city full of them. But you kept investigating, I guessed, recognizing the look in his eyes. It was the same one I saw in the mirror every day, the inability to let go of a case that didn't make sense. He nodded slowly. For a while. Found a few similar cases stretching back decades. Always the same pattern, people who felt watched, who reported strange occurrences, who disappeared leaving everything behind. Always that message, he is here. He rubbed his face, suddenly looking every one of his years. You know what the strangest part was? About a week after Corliss vanished, I started feeling like I was being watched too. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Did you see anything? No, he said quickly, too quickly. I dropped the investigation. Focused on other cases. And the feeling went away. He fixed me with an intense stare. I'd suggest you do the same, Detective Murray. Some trails aren't meant to be followed. I left Donovan's house with more questions than answers, his warning echoing in my mind. Back in my apartment, I set up my laptop and inserted the USB drive Eliza had given me. As she'd said, it was encrypted, but I had access to the department's tech division. I made a call, pulled some strings, and by midnight, I had the contents decrypted and downloaded. The drive contained a folder labeled simply Evidence. Inside were audio files, video clips, photographs, and a document titled If Found.docs. I opened the document first. If you're reading this, I'm probably gone, Wheeler's note began. I don't expect to be believed, but I need to record what I've learned. There is something that hunts people. I don't know what it is, a spirit, an entity, something from another dimension, maybe. What I do know is that it follows a pattern. First, it watches. You feel eyes on you when you're alone. Then, it manifests, small sounds at first, then visual glimpses. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. A figure in your peripheral vision. It's measuring you somehow, learning you. And when it's ready, it takes you. Where or why, I don't know. I've traced 12 disappearances over the past decade that follow this pattern. The victims vary, different ages, backgrounds, professions, but the progression is always the same. And now it's happening to me. If you're investigating my disappearance, check the camera I set up in my bedroom. You'll see what I saw. And know that I'm not crazy. The document ended with a list of names, the 12 disappearances he'd investigated, with Richard Corliss near the top. I spent hours going through the rest of the files, my unease growing with each piece of evidence. Wheeler had been thorough, meticulous in his investigation. These weren't the ravings of a paranoid mind, but the careful documentation of a trained journalist. And everything pointed to something beyond normal explanation. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I decided to return to Wheeler's apartment. I needed to see it again, to examine it with this new information in mind. The superintendent was reluctant to let me in at that hour, but my badge eventually convinced him. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it, still and silent in the darkness. I moved through the rooms methodically, examining every shadow, every corner. The air seemed colder than before, heavy with an expectant stillness. On the kitchen table, Wheeler's notebook lay open. I froze. I had collected all his notebooks as evidence, they should have been in the evidence locker at the precinct. Yet here one was, open to a page filled with his distinctive handwriting. I approached cautiously, reaching for my flashlight. The beam illuminated a single sentence written on the otherwise blank page, "You can already feel him." My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't written that. No one could have entered the secured apartment. I backed away from the notebook, instinctively reaching for my service weapon. I turned toward the bathroom, drawn by some inexplicable instinct. The mirror reflected the dim hallway behind me, and standing in that reflection, a tall, shadowy figure, indistinct but unmistakably present. I spun around, gun raised, but the hallway was empty. Just shadows and silence. My phone rang, the sound jarringly loud in the quiet apartment. I fumbled it from my pocket, staring at the screen in disbelief. The caller ID showed Jason Wheeler's name. I let it ring out, unable to bring myself to answer. A minute later, a voicemail notification appeared. With shaking fingers, I pressed play, holding the phone to my ear. There was no voice message, just the sound of static, broken intermittently by what might have been breathing. And beneath it all, almost too faint to hear, a whisper, "He is here." The next morning, I filed my report, officially classifying Wheeler's case as a disappearance without clear evidence of foul play. I handed over the evidence I'd collected, made my statements, and closed the case. On paper, at least. But I know better. Every night at 2:46 a.m., my phone rings. Wheeler's number. I never answer. I've started feeling watched in my apartment. Yesterday, I heard footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of something tall and shadowy. I understand now why Wheeler reached out to me specifically. I wasn't randomly chosen. I was next in line. What is the entity that stalks these victims, observing before it takes them? Why does it leave behind the same message? And most troubling of all, what happens to those who disappear? I don't have answers. But I know one thing with certainty, one night soon, my phone will stop ringing at 2:46. And someone else will find my apartment just as I found Wheeler's, everything in place, except me. And on the mirror, those 4 words, written with a trembling hand, "He is here."